be okay here. Hope you can hear me. It's good to be here. I love the opportunity to go around the state and meet with local officials and interested citizens who care to spend some time learning about this thing we call Chapter 70, the State Aid to Education formula. Some changes were made to it a few years ago that I think have made it simpler. Nevertheless, a lot of you, if you've dealt with it for a long time, probably think it's a black box. Only a few people in the state understand it. That is no longer the case. Citizens such as you and officials, I can tell in my everyday conversations, they've downloaded the materials on our website. All this is on our website. And they've even opened up the complete formula spreadsheet, which admittedly, is complicated, but there's no higher math involved in it. It's pretty straightforward in terms of the math, and the concepts are what sometimes throw people. What is it trying to accomplish? Well, the formula is determined in 3 basic steps. The foundation budget defines what is an adequate spending level for the kids in a school district based upon their different characteristics and the grade levels they're in. If they're low income, they get an extra dollop of money. Special ed, adds a significant component. Vocational programs cost more. All of these are factored into the foundation budget, and I will spend a little time just going over how that works. Next comes the minimum contribution, and sometimes called local contribution, but it's the minimum required contribution. And here's where we factor the equity into the formula first. The foundation budget we refer to as pupil equity. What is fair to spend on this group of kids given their characteristics? The minimum contribution is taxpayer equity. How much can this community, with their property and income and their mix of pupils, how much can they afford to pay towards that foundation budget? And then finally, almost as an afterthought, but the thing that most of you and officials care about is how much aid does the state give to cover that gap between the foundation budget and the minimum contribution. So that's the formula in a nutshell. There really are 6 factors that play a predominant role in the formula. 3 on the foundation budget side, and then 3 on the taxpayer equity, local contribution side. First of all, on the foundation budget, it's enrollment, as you'd expect. Something called the wage adjustment factor that attempts to recognize that it costs a different amount to attract teachers to come live in certain parts of the state, and so this is a geographic measure. And then finally, inflation, which actually raises the foundation budget each year, and that applies equally to all cities and towns. Then on the local taxpayer equity side, it's property value as measured by DOR with the equalized property valuation. That puts all communities on an even scale so that the fact that they're on a 3-year assessment schedule shouldn't make any difference. They should all be placed as if they were assessing their property at the same time. Income, we're one of a handful of states that tries to factor income into the formula. And even before we made the changes in fiscal 07, going all the way back to 93, income has been a component of the formula. Well, it makes sense, but it's a different kind of wealth. Property wealth is tangible. You can see it. You can measure it. Our assessing practices are getting so much better compared to when I first got into this field. Income is what economists would call the flow of wealth. Property is the stock. Income is the flow. Income is how much you actually have available to pay the tax bill. Income, as we measure it, attempts to look at how much does it hurt a taxpayer when they actually make out the tax bill and pay it. That's why we have both measures of wealth in the formula. And then finally, DOR calculates a measure related to Prop 2.5. Understanding that you're limited in terms of how much you can raise in your tax and levy limit. DOR for many years has done this municipal revenue growth factor, which looks not just at the tax levy, but does factor in new growth. And so when people go around saying, we just get a 2.5% bump up in the levy limit, that is not the case. The average is about 4 statewide. Communities that are already built up pretty much and don't have a lot of open space often are down near that 2.5% level, but you've got other communities that are building like crazy. They add in a new mall, all kinds of commercial business. Although the DOR factor does have some checks on that, so that if you build a new mall, it's not going to make it look like you have to put a huge amount of new money into schools because of that. There's kind of a circuit breaker that protects communities from that. But these 6 factors, any one of them in any given year can have an influence on your calculations. People always focus on enrollment, and that is important, but I've never been able to actually tell you or gauge or measure which one of these is the most important factor. They all play together, and not always in the same way every year. So here's the rub on Chapter 70. In Massachusetts, we call it the Commonwealth. The fact is we have greatly disparate levels of wealth. You've been around the state. You've seen it yourself. We have some very wealthy communities, and we have some very poor communities. Not the biggest disparity in the United States, apparently. I've looked into this. Actually, it's the Gulf states that have the biggest disparity. But ours are pretty big, and it's pretty easy to see that some of these communities up on the board should get less. They have less ability to pay than some of their wealthiest, than some of their poorer counterparts. So it's inverse to wealth. The poorer you are, the more aid you should get. The wealthier you are, you should get less aid than these poorer communities. But what I've seen so much over the years is that communities compare themselves to their neighbor, not taking into effect these differences, sometimes not slight differences, in those 6 factors. And so they say, well, we're just like that town, so why don't we get the same amount of aid? That's human nature, I think. But when people really delve into it, I think some of the changes I'm going to tell you that we put in place in fiscal '07 have greatly lessened the degree of enemy or angst, whatever you want to call it, among local citizens when they compare their towns and their districts to their neighbors. And, I say that from the heart, knowing that I can get in trouble because I might be talking to an audience where not everyone is happy with the formula. It's not universally accepted as being a perfect formula by any means, but it's a lot better than it was even a decade ago. In the governor's proposal, which now has been adopted in a local aid resolution by both the House and the Senate, so it looks like this is what we're going to have for fiscal 15. It's really, compared to some past years, it's a modest aid increase. But some of the things it does formulaically help make some really good progress towards the goals that I'm going to tell you about in a second. Okay, let's start with the foundation budget. You can see that the rates that are assigned to the different grade levels and programs vary. And these are the result of some studies that were done way back in '93. So if you're one of those people that has heard the formula is out of date, well, yes, a lot of stuff has happened since 1993 in terms of what schools have to offer. And so parts of it, I think you could make a very strong case. The foundation budget needs to be updated. And how that happens, we've had all kinds of proposals for review commissions and, you know, there's a whole cottage industry out there of academics who go from state to state, you know, looking at the foundation budget or that state's equivalent, coming out with findings, and they go from state to state and do that in these court cases. So we had a court case called the Hancock case that actually the finding was in the state's favor. The Commonwealth was found to be, you know, doing a good job of making progress. We haven't got all the way yet, but we are making progress. And so that was the opportunity for a lot of people to criticize the foundation budget. And my feeling is, it really, the case ended up being not as much about the foundation assumptions back in '93. You know, how many teachers do you need at the different grade levels? How much do you pay the teachers? You know, what do you need for maintenance, administration? All these, there actually are 11 different functional areas in the foundation budget. And how much do you need in each one? The formula actually assigns a cost based on how many kids you have in each of these categories. First, the enrollment categories, and I'd point out that in addition to the head counts being in 10 categories, which you're going to see in a moment, which are grade level and program level, there are assumed enrollments for special ed, both in district and out of district, 3.75% of the foundation enrollment. Well, normally when people hear that, they say, that is so unfair. You know, we're sending 17%, 19% of our kids out on special ed. Yeah, but not all those kids who have IEPs cost the $24,000, $25,000 that the assumption is in the formula. So that 3.75% is an assumed full-time equivalent. It assumes that a special ed kid on the average would be in services 25% of the time. And the initial, that 14% of the kids would be in special ed 25% of the time. And a few years ago, that was raised to 15%. But, you know, when you're talking about some of the kids in IEPs with like speech therapy or something like that, it does not cost $24,000. We have looked to compare to what districts actually spend in these categories. I think everyone at the department is in agreement now. Yes, some of those assumptions could be ramped up. And that's after taking into account the fact that we have the special ed circuit breaker program, which is funding on top of Chapter 70. So yes, the special ed costs, since these initial assumptions were put in place, have gotten higher and higher. And in my opinion, those represent one of two categories in the foundation that really is demonstrably too low, that the assumption should be raised. And then secondly, we have an add-on, if you're a low-income kid, that provides a substantial bump up. You know, it's hard to quantify how much it actually costs if you're categorized as low income, but in Massachusetts, it's more than $3,000 on the average. So it's a significant bump up, recognizing that many of those kids probably do need additional services, and those have costs associated with them. I have a feeling that we may not have had enough printouts, or maybe just enough, but in your packet, some of these reports with the fine print that I'm showing you up here, I've included the full page version. So, the enrollment categories go across the top. The assumed sped is over on the right, and then the increments for low income are to the right of that. Yeah, page 6. Okay. Now, when we say foundation enrollment, you know, it often doesn't match what you look at your own school. Yes, we do compute it by taking what your school district has reported to us, But foundation enrollment is attempting to recognize financial responsibility, the kids for which a district or a town is responsible for financially. So kids who go to other districts through school choice, to charter schools, they're counted in foundation enrollment. Kids who come into your district through school choice or any other special ed, tuition agreements, anything like that, they're not counted in foundation enrollment because your district is not paying for them. It's the sending district that actually is sending you the tuition. So foundation enrollment throws people in because it's an amalgam of two different perspectives on enrollment. But it is a necessary one when you're doing a state aid formula. So there are the 11 functional categories that all have different rates associated with them. And so we simply multiply the head count times those rates to determine these amounts that you see in each category, in each cell of this matrix. And when you put those all together, you see at the bottom the foundation budget and how much that is per pupil. So Triton is a little bit below the state average, but this is Triton's foundation. 10,400 something, yeah. So the local contribution recognizes that, as I said before, funding foundation comes first from local taxpayers, then from state aid. So each community has a different target local share that's determined by looking at its property value and its income and its pupils. So these changes were put in place in 2007. You know, we had just won the Hancock case, and actually there was an excellent period of a couple years of all branches in state government, executive and legislative, working with a lot of the professional organizations to try to figure, well, now that the court has ruled that we're doing okay, you know, what do we do with the formula? Typically what happens in these court cases, if they find against the Commonwealth or the state, is that they'll impose a formula, or they'll say back to the legislature, now you figure it out, to come up with something else. Well, here was a great opportunity not to be told by the court what to do, but actually to look at the existing formula and address some of the problems that were clear to us by that point. And a lot of that had to do with the fact, not with the foundation budget. I've told you before, it appears here we are entering fiscal 15. Yes, I think it's clear that two parts of the foundation are probably too low. I mentioned the special ed costs, and then the assumptions about benefits, the insurances, retirement. You know, what districts actually spend on those categories is more than double what is in the foundation budget. So there's been a lot of criticism about the foundation, throw the whole thing out. Actually, of the 11 categories, in my eyes, 9 of them are pretty much in sync with what districts spend. So it's only those 2 that I think really cry out for someone to be willing to look at them, try to make some assumptions, like how much should a district be expected to spend for benefits and insurance? You know, that there's been great progress recently in getting communities and districts to join the Group Insurance Commission. I mean, do we tie the foundation budget to their behavior? You know, of those factors that I showed you, none of them really are anything you have any influence in. There's very little in this formula that reflects your choice of one behavior or another. For example, one of them that does count is whether you choose to go to full-day kindergarten. The rate is twice what it is if you're charging tuition for full day, or the kids are going just half day. So there's an example. A decision locally, you can influence the formula. You get more money for the free full-day kindergarten. You could say the same thing about your pre-K pupils. But besides that, you know, there's very little you can do to influence those 6 factors. Be a school district, a good school district, and attract parents to move into town to go to your school district. I mean, that's something everyone would consider good. But income, property value, all these, the wage factor, the municipal revenue growth factor, inflation. I get asked several times a year, what's inflation going to be next year? If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be doing this job. I'd be someplace else. You know, it's just, that makes it hard to project in this formula how it's going to work in future years. It would be nice if we could say, here's a 5-year projection. We know what inflation and property values is going to look like 5 years from now. I've given up pretending to be able to do that. The best we can hope for is to put in provisions that protect districts from sudden changes downward on the aid, and I think that has been done in almost every single year. So we got together, you know, a lot of us, and we did some analysis, and we came up with a proposal that would greatly enhance the equity, the taxpayer equity part of the formula, not the foundation budget, although we did make some changes to that were neutral, because they now conform to the way that districts record and report their spending data. Prior to fiscal '07, that was not the case. And so it made it hard to make any judgments about whether the old foundation budget was valid or not. Now we can do those comparisons. And that's why I can tell you those 2 categories looks like they're too low in the foundation budget. The equity part of the old formula, the taxpayer equity, you know, it was good in the beginning back in '94. They had property and they had income. They had a cap beyond which a community, if they were being required to tax at that higher level, they were allowed to drift down. The problem with it is that the wealth factors really were never fully updated each year. And so one of I would say we had 2 main goals. Keep everything current to reflect current economic circumstances, and keep it simple, because the old formula was really difficult to wade through. You've heard of the 35-column formula, some of you, and you know, it used to be that I'd be up here in a situation like this saying, okay, we're going to start with column 1 and wade through until we get to column 35. And people looked aghast. Like, are we really going to go through this complicated formula? I think we've made it simpler. And I can tell that because I can tell the public and local officials are asking questions that show they understand how this works. So let's give it a try. We start with the statewide foundation budget as a total. And then a policy decision has been made every year since '07. Local contributions are going to represent 59% of that statewide total foundation budget. And of that 59%, which you can see works out to $5.8 billion in fiscal '15, half of that is going to come from property, and half of that is going to come from a town's income. So, sure enough, you split it 3.5 and 3.5, and then that gets ramped down to a lower amount equally, so that exactly 59% comes from property and income. The reason it gets ramped down is when you compute these targets, some of the wealthier communities are so much wealthier that their income and property just put them way up here. And so the legislature and governors past, have always decided there will be a minimum that we require a community to make, to receive in state aid. That means there'd be a maximum level of effort to fund foundation budget, and the amount that was chosen was 82.5% of foundation. That's why we have more than 130 communities that are at that cap. You know, they might otherwise have been required to fund 90 or 110, in some extreme cases 300 or 400. You know, think of some of the towns down on the Cape with the second homes. You know, why would the state require a community to spend more than 100% of foundation? And so this 82.5% cap, while some people look at it as being a little bit too munificent for some of the wealthiest communities, that's what we have in place. And that was a hard compromise to make in the legislature, and so I doubt we're going to see any change on that. I'm not even sure I would suggest any change. So, to determine a particular town's effort, you apply a fixed percentage of its property and a separate fixed percentage to its income. Now, these are the only two percentages which will yield exactly that 59% being split both ways evenly between the two factors. So it changes just a little bit each year because, you know, towns' property is changing more relative to other towns or less. Income, same thing. But it's essentially like a fixed tax rate because it's the same percentage being applied to every single town on their property and their income. Now, an important point is that does not mean that for a particular town, you know, half of their effort is going to come from property and half is going to come from income. It does not mean that, because those same fixed percentages, when applied to one of the Cape towns, again, as an example, you know, they're going to yield like 95% coming from property and 5% from income. But the important point is the same rule, the same factor is being applied to every single city and town. And when we get through with that calculation, we add them together, and that's the combined effort yield. That's the amount that, for that particular year, the state establishes as your target local contribution. So Newbury, Rowley, and Salisbury are lined up next to each other on this particular report. And you can see the same data on 3 separate reports in your packets. But just to show you, the same percentages are being applied. They yield different results. There's the combined effort yield, and that gets translated by comparing to foundation budget into a local target share percentage. So, you know, 2 of the communities, Newbury and Salisbury, are at that cap. These numbers would actually have placed them at some level above the 82.5%. So they are among the 130 communities that get dropped down to 82.5%. That's out of 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. So, you know, almost a third we talk about. And Rowley has a target of 77%. So in all these cases, you subtract from 100 to determine how much state aid that particular town would have as a target. 17.5% for the 2 of them, and then for Rowley, 22.83%. You know, those change from year to year because your property and your income and your kids all are changing every year. So, you know, having established these targets, a lot of people ask, well, okay, why don't you just bring all the towns to their targets in one fell swoop? Well, with Prop 2.5, you cannot do that. You can't say to those who are below their targets, you got to get up to the target. Instead, we establish a particular year's required contribution, which hopefully gets them closer, either up closer, or if they're in the almost 80% of communities who are actually being required to contribute more than their target, then we bring them down closer. But to bring them all the way would cost more money than the state has available to, or is willing or has chosen. We've gone through a couple tight years in recent years. Nevertheless, we can show that progress has been made towards getting communities to their targets. And so, I guess that's my main point, is that you can establish targets, but to actually fund them to get communities to those targets, first of all, it would generate so much state aid for some communities, I don't think they'd know what to do with it, because it would be replacing local contribution with state aid. But eventually, over time, that's where we want to get to. And we want to make sure that these are current targets so that we update the income and the enrollment every 2 years, the growth factors, the wage factors, not the property. That gets equalized by DOR every 2 years. So we start by raising last year's required contribution for the town by the municipal revenue growth factor. That yields what we call the preliminary contribution. So everyone goes up to start out with. Then we see how does that requirement compare to that particular year's target. If you're one of the 79%, you drop down a certain percentage to get closer to that target. This year is the greatest percentage that we've had. In past years, it's ranged between 15 and 33%. This year, it's at 50%. And I hope that means that within 1 year, maybe fiscal 16, we'll be able to bring all those those communities who are being required to make too much effort down to their targets. The problem is on the other end with the 20% or 21% of communities that, through no fault of their own, found themselves in fiscal '07 being required to spend, in some cases, a lot less than what an equitable target seemed to be, because the old formula did not have these definitions of targets. For most communities, it used to be go up by the growth factor each year, without any calculations saying, well, where should they be? What is the right amount? The old formula was really geared more towards getting the pupil equity component of the formula up to speed, and it accomplished that beautifully in the years between '94 and 2000. And then, having accomplished that, I think people were looking at the taxpayer equity component but not knowing quite what to do. So this formula that I'm describing to you, I think, is an equitable way of dealing with the issue of who should pay how much. So if you're in, was there a question? Okay. Okay. Yes. We get the money from DOR, but you're not asking that question. You're saying the town can't access that?
Well, I know you get it from the state taxes.
Yeah.
But does that mean that the people in the town make more income, the town has to pay a higher share?
Yes.
But how is the town supposed to get the money?
Well,
I mean, they get it from property taxes, but that doesn't matter if you're making a lot of money, but you're not in a big house.
but typically people who are making a lot of money are in a big house.
But then why don't you just go on property tax?
Because
I mean,
we have,
I'm going down the budget.
because we have a lot of communities that were complaining about the fact that it made them look like their residents were so wealthy, whereas in truth, their residents often were, like in the Cape, a lot of senior citizens, where the income was way out of, and so I think it's good economic practice to recognize both types of wealth. Well, see, this is what I was talking about earlier, where the concepts sometimes throw people. But actually, economists have validated that this particular approach does make sense, that there are two different types of wealth, and that it's important to recognize both those types of wealth. So,
I recognize it, but I don't understand how the town gets more money to pay for a school other than from the
well, remember, these are being used to establish targets. We're trying to get communities closer to those targets, but we're starting with the preliminary contribution, which is the growth factor, which does recognize how much of an increase can the town afford this year. So the only case in which the formula is asking a town to exceed what that percentage is that DOR calculates would be if they're more than 2.5%, between 2.5% and 7.5%, they would be asked to tack on an additional 1% to their growth factor. Over 7.5%, unfortunately, we don't have as many of those, an additional 2%. So otherwise, we're never going to get some of those lower effort communities up to their target. I hope that helps. So we've got 279 communities that are being brought down by 50% closer to the targets. We've got 72 communities that are asked to go up by their preliminary contribution, or in some cases, an additional 1 or 2% on top of that. So here are the annual increments getting closer to the targets. You know, starting with the growth factor. You can see they are more than 2.5%. The average statewide is like 3.74% this year. So that you start with last year's required contribution, and remember, this is the town-wide. So this is mostly for these towns, Triton, but also it includes Whittier kids and in a few cases Essex agricultural, because the contribution needs to spread around to all your kids that you're financially responsible for. So it would also include kids who are going out through school choice and charter schools. Okay, so that leaves Newbury with $1 million excess above its target. 50% of that is $531,000, and so we go from a preliminary contribution of 8.1 down to 7.6. That's good progress. And so all three of the communities are actually starting out, when you apply the growth factor to last year's requirement, they're starting out at points that exceed their targets. And so all of them get credited with that 50% reduction. And I think if you looked at the minimum contribution on your sheet, you'll see that all three of them see a reduction in the required contribution. Okay, now we get to, how's it affecting Newbury? So this is a comparison back to fiscal '07, the first year in which these targets were established. And on the left, it's showing the target. On the dark green, it's showing what, after doing all these calculations, the town was being required to contribute. So that's where Newbury was the first year. Their target was 82.5. In fact, it stayed that way all the way through. It's ranged from 74.7, and now it's gotten to the point where it's no longer in that lower category, it's in the higher effort category. And that can happen through a combination of the enrollment, the property value, and the income. All of these can play a role in coming up with a situation like this over time. So this is where they end up. A target of 82 and a requirement is, I think that's 89. Here's Rowley. They started out above, and they stayed that way ever since, but just slightly. They're just slightly above their requirement. The effort reduction has not been sufficient to get them all the way down. And then Salisbury is a more dramatic change over time. You can see they started out at a target of 61, and back in '07. Remember, I'm not saying this in any pejorative sort of sense when a community is below its target or above its target. They were assigned these targets by the old formula, their requirements by the old formula. They were doing nothing wrong. They were just doing what the state said they had to do. Now the state comes up with a better definition of what they should be doing, what they should be spending. And so this is where they started out in fiscal '07. And you can see those targets have been going up steadily ever since, to the point where they're now at 82.5%. And I attribute a lot of this to the fact that their enrollment has gone down. Salisbury has, since fiscal '07, lost 19% of its enrollment total, mostly at Triton. I believe that Newbury has gone down 17%, and Rowley's gone down 12%. So all three are declining. So, I mean, there's nothing necessarily bad about that. Statewide, about 60% of districts are losing enrollment. We're seeing big enrollment gains in some of the gateway cities, but who's to say it's a bad thing to lose enrollment? But it is a problem in terms of, you still have to fund the schools. Okay, so this shows a scattergram where back in '07, this is how the distribution of the targets looked. And a community above that target was being required to make significantly, in some cases, more required contribution than its target. And this is where we stand in fiscal '15. A community that's below the target has not been ramped up with that 1 or 2% to get all the way up to their targets in some cases. Although the first graph we showed there was a case where that did happen with Newbury. It's a much tighter distribution. Far fewer communities being required to make significantly more contribution than their target, and far fewer being way below their target. So this is progress. In spite of all the stuff we've had to go through the last few years, actually I give credit to the legislature and governors. They have, especially with the infusion of some fiscal stimulus money, they have placed a priority on education. And so when we go to conferences and see other states and hear some of the stuff they went through, we feel so lucky because our legislature did protect us from some really deep cuts that some other states went through. Okay, finally, I won't linger too long on this, but in your packet it shows how it works. The total contribution for a town has to be allocated among the districts to which the town belongs. So most of it goes to Triton, but there you can see. Now, I do want to touch on this. This is a change. The 5 kids, we used Rowley as an example here. 5 kids that used to be, they would be assigned to Essex County. But Essex Ag, as you know, has been merged with North Shore. So those kids remain the fiscal responsibility of your town, only they're not going to be treated as Essex or North Shore kids for foundation enrollment purposes. You're going to be paying non-resident tuition for those pupils, just as any pupil who was going to an ag program, because the local district does not offer an ag program. They are eligible for non-resident tuition. And that's something we've tried to make clear to all the towns in this part of the state, to budget for a fairly high tuition rate, which is likely to be in the 17 or 18,000 range. However, we took the aid that was going on behalf of those kids to Essex, and we allocated it in the fiscal 15 calculations to the member towns. That should help pay for some of the cost, not all, for these kids going to Essex North Shore. And the way we allocate the contribution is we do it proportional to the foundation budget of those kids. So that makes sense. And if you actually looked at the foundation per pupil for the kids at Whittier, you'd find it's significantly higher than the kids at Triton, because VOC programs tend to cost more. And the foundation budget reflects that. So the aid calculations. Yes. The foundation, yes, Whittier's foundation budget reflects the higher cost of vocational kids. I'd not. Okay. Well, no. I don't think, no, I thought you were talking about the Whittier column. The Whittier column continues to represent the kids from Rowley, in that example you used, going to Whittier. The kids in the Rowley column, the local district column, those are the kids now being paid for by Rowley directly by a tuition bill going to Essex North Shore. That's the way the non-resident tuition program works and is funded. No, they're not paid by Triton. The change is that Essex had legislation from more than a decade ago that authorized a per pupil assessment on the cherry sheet to each town. And so the money actually was transferred to the local aid distribution. Now there's going to be a tuition bill sent from Essex North Shore to the sending towns, which is the way it works with other vocational programs and towns. No. Well, I disagree with that, because you still have town meeting needing to approve. Town meeting still gets to approve or disapprove their budget. They do. Yeah. Don't you have a vote at your town meeting to approve the Whittier budget? Okay. But they, okay. So the aid calculation, we're getting to the end here. You start with how much aid did the district get last year? In the case of Triton, $8.3 million. Then we look at the foundation budget for this year. We subtract the required contribution for the 3 member towns of Triton. That adds up to $21 million. And then we compute what's called foundation aid. That's the foundation minus the required contribution equals foundation aid. So for Triton, that would be less than half of what they're receiving now, 3.8 million. They actually are getting 8.3, and so they do not get foundation aid. They don't need any increase in foundation to get closer to their foundation budget. Down payment aid is a provision that was in effect in fiscal '08 and fiscal '09, then slightly modified by the Senate and the legislature in the last couple of years. But now we're back to doing it this way. There's similar calculations. The whole concept is that effort reduction, if it doesn't get you down to being a foundation aid district, won't generate any additional aid. But we know that when you get down to that target, you're going to be getting additional foundation aid. And so the whole concept of a down payment, this is some new aid to get you closer to your target. Again, it's not 100%. This year it's 35%. But it does make some progress. And instead of waiting to get all that aid all in one fell swoop when those above effort communities come down to the targets, you get a chunk of it this year, getting you closer. That does not affect any of the 3 towns here. And then what does affect Triton is minimum aid per pupil, $25 per pupil. You know, it's not a huge amount, but it is an increase. It means they keep going up. And that is how the aid calculation works. You know, it's fairly straightforward. So we saw earlier that Salisbury in particular was seeing its target contribution rise, mostly due to the enrollment decrease. I mean, it had the same EQV, property value. It had the same income, but the number of pupils that those combined effort yield was being spread across was lesser, and so the formula interprets that as meaning they can make more effort for that cohort of pupils. When you put the 3 towns together, we take a weighted average of their targets, and that's why when we look at Triton's target aid percentage, we can see that it's going down. It started out at 30.5%. The district was pretty close to that. It started out getting 32%, you know. But as the member towns' target local percentages kept going up, that's going to have a reverse effect on Triton's target aid. If the towns can make more effort, then the formula interprets that as meaning the district doesn't need as much to reach foundation. So that's a pretty marked change. They're down now to 19.2 as a target. But look at this. They're still getting 32% of their foundation budget in aid. Why would that be? Okay, this takes some explaining. There are 4 factors we're looking at here. The aid is in red. This goes all the way back to fiscal '93, the year before ed reform came into effect. And it makes it look like there was a huge jump there, but that's because Triton went fully regional in fiscal '95. And then since then, you know, its enrollment was going up. You can see that because that would be reflected in the foundation budget, going up rapidly during the '90s. That was typical of the statewide trend. The dotted line here shows required net school spending. So Triton had a requirement that in most years was right at its foundation budget. It was a foundation aid district. It needed that extra aid to keep pace with the enrollment change, and inflation was higher back then as well. Now we get to fiscal '04, you notice a big drop. Well, Triton didn't suffer as much as half the districts did, which was a 20% cut. You remember that was a recession too. the early part of the 2000s. And so fiscal '04 was cut by 20% for half the districts. Not Triton, it was cut 13%, because any more means that it would have been below its foundation budget. So the foundation is a protection to districts from catastrophic type of cuts. And I mean, the legislature all the way through and in the court case and everything, there was no question that the legislature would ever allow a district to be required to spend less than its foundation budget. But after that cut, it's been kind of slow going. This is the first year of the reforms. There were some increases in their first couple of years, something called growth aid. But in the years since fiscal 10, you can see the foundation budget here has been going down on a steady decline. The requirement continues to go up because we haven't got the three towns down to their target. Once we did, it would be more likely that Triton would end up being back as a foundation aid district. And we're making progress this year, so I'm hopeful. And then finally, the top line shows what is actually being spent. Currently, in the fiscal 14, Triton has budgeted to spend 8% above its requirement. The state average is 16%, so it's less than typical, for districts. There are some communities who spend right at their requirement, and there are some communities who spend between 95% and 100% of their requirement, in which case we add that shortfall onto the next year's formula requirement to make sure it ends up getting spent on the kids. And the last couple years, unfortunately, there have been a few districts that fall below the 95% that is allowed by law. And when that happens, we just take the aid away in the year after the shortfall occurs. And so we're now looking at some serious shortfalls and aid penalties in a few districts, not a lot. But this is not, it's hard to characterize the districts in that situation. There are small towns in some cases, there are cities in others. But the commissioner sent out 30 letters this year to districts that were below their spending requirement. Which indicates, times are still tough for towns. That's the highest number of letters he's had to send out ever. So we're not out of the woods yet. And there has been progress on the aid. I think you'd have to agree that compared to that other scattergram we showed, this is not showing the same level of improvement, because there's almost no interest in taking aid away from these districts who, that's what their target says they should be getting. Instead, in some cases, they're getting way up here. This is percentage of foundation. Under Prop 2.5, the legislature and governor can't simply take aid away from a district because they can't replace that money. And so there's been this hold harmless, in fact, a pretty good tradition of minimum aid increases each year that has protected these districts up here from losing aid and getting down all the way to their target. And that, I think, is the paradigm for the future, because we hope the formula can make steady progress for those who are aggrieved. That's these communities down here. They're getting less than what the state says they should be getting. And they were aggrieved when they found that out. And, the formula is good, is robust at getting them closer up to their target. So, I guess at this point, you done? Yeah.
Thank you, Roger. First of all, I'd like to have our representatives and senators, if they've got any questions, to bring them. I know Brad needs to. You're here to listen. Lenny? Listen. Katie? Senator Todd? You're good. All right. How about any of the selectmen? Do we have any questions on how this works? No? Okay, school committee? All right. Yeah, come on. And the microphone so they're recording from here.
Mr. Hatch, thank you for coming. Robin Williams, school committee member. Back in 1993, when the original formula was created, just like today, it seems to have these two halves with the foundation budget. So I'd like to address that side of it. Despite the fact that changes were made in 2007 to the other side of it, the minimum local contributions and all, you spoke about the two components of the 11 pieces that you feel, and Mass Budget has come out to say, are significantly underfunded. So when we talk about foundation budget and you identify this number that a community should be spending to adequately educate
Right.
students.
The minimum amount that they should be spending.
Right, the
Yes.
minimum amount.
Yeah.
I would, like, just off the top of your head, those two components, one being special education costs, the other being the cost of health care and all that, that are radically different today than they were in 1993. Could you guess at a percentage that if those were reworked, how that would change foundation? Like, is foundation significantly lower than it should be by 10 or 20% or 30%? Or, because we all know we're spending over foundation, but we know foundation isn't real. Based on, bad use of terms, but
Yeah.
isn't as accurate as it could be based
Yeah.
on today's demands.
The Superintendent's Association has quantified the amount as somewhere around $2 billion out of a $9 billion foundation budget. But the assumption behind that, I have to take, I disagree with a little bit, because that looks at what districts are actually spending. Well, you can't tell me that every district is spending at just an adequate spending level. There are plenty of them that are spending well in excess of what they really need. So I think that estimate of $2 billion needs to be brought down to a more reasonable level. And the other point I'd make about that, don't want to scare the legislature with that large number. Remember, 59% of that gets covered by local communities. It's not going to be 1.5 or $2 billion
Sure.
in new state aid. More than half of that is going to come from communities and their required contributions.
I go back to a slide you had earlier that said Triton is spending approximately 8% above foundation, and
Yeah.
statewide it's 16%.
Yeah.
So
Above required
Required
spending.
local.
Yeah. Yes.
So I just wondered, does that 8% feel like that's reasonable over, based on those two categories that are?
And I spend a lot of time dealing with the ones who are between 95 and 100%. And so 8%, it seems like a reasonable amount. It doesn't stand out as being exorbitant or, I also deal with some of the ones who are spending more than 200%. So where's the right amount? Right now we have this definition of a minimum adequate amount, which is the foundation.
Which would you say is not adequate based on those two categories? And so that turns my question to the legislature, just the need to do it, and what is the will on the Hill to address those two categories?
We've come out in our report to the legislature saying that those two particular categories need to be looked at, but looked at by whom, in what context, what forum, a commission, an academic study, a legislative, review panel, or how that gets done. There's been talk of that for many years. But it's hard. It's hard to change a school finance formula. We were lucky in fiscal '07 that all of us were able to work together to get some changes. So it can be done. Maybe it's as simple as just saying raise the rate for insurance and for special ed. You know, the governor actually tried that last year on the special ed piece. You know, you wouldn't need a commission to do that. That's something that, you know, legislative language can do. But on the other hand, there are people who want the full-fledged, you know, the cottage industry of academics coming from around the country to waltz into Massachusetts and do their thing and come out with some figure, which probably is going to be higher than what we have now. So I'm not in a position where I can say this is what to do.
No, but
But,
I just
yeah.
appreciate your opinion on,
Yeah.
on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. Either microphone. You're close to this one, Brad.
Just to answer your question, the report that was done, Senator Tarr and I actually got the language into the Ed Reform Bill a couple years ago, because we have been very concerned for the last 10 years about this formula and how it affects all of our districts. Every district that I represent, in my opinion, is hurt by the formula and by the way they distribute Chapter 70. So we actually, and we'll tell a couple of stories out of tail here, we actually went to New York, to Columbia University, and met with a professor there who actually sued the city of New York on their formula and how they distribute their education money, because we're so concerned on how it's being distributed here in Massachusetts in our district that we felt we had to go and look at other ways to possibly change this formula. You've already been told that this formula was changed because of a lawsuit. In my opinion, Senator Tarr's opinion, the pendulum has swung since 1993 from here to here. And we feel very strongly now that our districts are being hurt as some other districts were back in 1993. We've actually set up a group out of Manchester, out of Hamilton, and out of Marblehead that are looking at actually suing the state on the formula. Yes, and we're moving forward, we think. It does cost some funding to do that, and we've been asking communities to come up with some funding, and that's where we've now hit somewhat of a brick wall. But back to the study that they did. It was a very good study. A lot of what you saw today was in that study, and they did make some recommendations. We are looking at offering amendments to the state budget to try and rectify some of these problems, as we did in '07. But we have ran up against some brick walls up on Beacon Hill, to be very honest with you, with the leadership of the House and in the Senate. They want to take baby steps to fix this formula. We want to do it now. In '07, we felt very strongly we could have made these changes, but they only adopted a few. So we're going to continue to do that on your behalf, offering these amendments, and certainly what you've recommended will be part of that in the FY15 budget debate. We've already sat down and talked about how we can move forward to try and make more changes. We've tried to add more money to Chapter 70 just last week. The Republican caucus offered in both the House and in the Senate resolutions that would have increased your Chapter 70 to $50 a student. The governor proposed $25 a student, and the House and the Senate adopted $25 as well. We offered $50, and unfortunately down party lines it failed. We tried, and this is something that's very, very frustrating to us legislators, as we have just found out within the past couple of months that our lottery aid that goes directly to our cities and towns, $75 million of those dollars are being diverted into the general fund of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That is supposed to be going to you. And we tried to, through the resolution, add that $75 million back to the lottery, and once again it failed. Which was very frustrating, because under the proposal of the lottery, when it was set up, after expenses, after prizes, all of those dollars are supposed to go back to the cities and towns. $75 million is being diverted into the general fund. That should be going to you, and that could be going toward your education. Everybody in this room should be very upset about that. That is your money. And Steve Grossman, our treasurer, is going around this state saying how robust our lottery is. It's one of the best in the nation. It's actually one of the best in the world in terms of revenue. And yet, we have now taken money once again from that account, and we've diverted it into other programs. And I would hope that the next time we try and put that money back, which we're going to try again during the budget, that we can get some assistance from the selectmen across the state. We didn't hear a peep out of anybody last week on this particular proposal, which was frustrating, and I think the leadership of the House felt since we didn't hear a peep, we're okay with what we're proposing by adding a few dollars here and there. So directly to your question, we are going to be offering amendments to try and fix this particular formula with some of the suggestions that Mr. Hatch has made. And we are also looking to work with that group once again because we do feel that at this point, a lawsuit may be the only opportunity we have. We tried, and I'm sorry I'm going on, but you need to know this because we're here to educate ourselves on this. When you saw a little bit of an increase in one of the slides, that was when the legislature had agreed to bring everybody up to 17.5% of their foundation budget. Because again, we argued, and we have our chairman of the Ipswich School Committee here as well, they're at 14% of state aid for their foundation budget. They were much, much lower about 5 years ago. So Hamilton Wenham at one point was below the 17.5. Lori Ehrlich, I don't know if you know that name, Rep. Ehrlich from Marblehead has been working in a bipartisan manner with us to bring all school districts up to 17.5%. Now, as Republicans, and I'm not being partisan, I'm saying you're going to look at us and say, you got to spend a lot of money in order to bring everybody up to that target share and to the 17.5%. The fact of the matter is, we have increased our budget by $10 billion over the last 10 years. We have averaged a $1 billion increase every single year. So it comes down to priorities. Are you going to fund education? Are you going to fund homelessness, drug programs? I mean, we have 200 legislators with 200 different opinions. But I can assure you in this room, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, the local aid has been a priority. And the 17.5% would only cost about $100 million. This year we have $1.2 billion extra dollars to play with in FY15. We would argue we should be taking those dollars and putting it into this to bring more school districts up to their target share. And we believe we have the money to do that. We would ask you for your help because we're going to be offering that amendment as well. And in the chapter, the circuit breaker law, which Lenny was not around when we passed it, but Bruce and I worked very hard with our colleagues to get that passed. We finally have, in my opinion, funded it in a way we should. I think we're up to 72%, and I look to the superintendent because I don't know what our exact numbers are, but I think we're up and around the 72, 73% range, which for a few years it was a 68%. And we're one of the only states that actually do something with the special ed in funding it, which I'm sure you have found as you've gone around the country. We do one of the better jobs when it comes to special ed, but we wanted to make sure it was fully funded, and we've been working very hard to do that. So those are the priorities that we're working on in the FY15 budget on your behalf. This is what we heard from you that you wanted to see. And we're also, the last thing I will say is, and the superintendent has a red line to our offices, and he's been very clear that we need to take some of these unfunded mandates that we're putting on you, on these reports that you have to fill out and other things. And you've actually sent us lists of what those unfunded mandates are. I know Ipswich has done it, Hamilton Wenham has done it, and I can't speak for Newbury and West Newbury, but send us a list. And we're going to try and offer amendments to make it a little bit easier on you folks when it comes to those unfunded mandates. Long-winded answer, but that's what we're going to be trying to do in the budget. And I know Senator Tarr wants to touch upon a couple of things as well, if that's all right.
Thank you.
So I actually have a packet, but I know it's been a long night, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'm going to leave it here for people with some information that I think you'll find very important about the discussion that we're having. But I want to begin by thanking the selectmen for getting us together to have this discussion. It's a critical discussion for us to have, particularly because it allows us to link our efforts on Beacon Hill to your efforts locally so that we can work together and try to establish priorities and move those priorities. I also want to say thank you to Roger. Roger Hatch is one of the folks that knows this situation and this budget and this formula as well as anyone in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he's an incredible resource to all of us as legislators, and he's also an incredible resource to you. And I'm glad that he was able to find the time to come out here tonight. And Roger, thank you very much for that. And so I would suggest to you that Roger is right in one respect, that we have simplified the foundation budget formula in many ways. But I would also suggest to you that it is not as straightforward as we might like it to be. And so when we have these discussions, oftentimes it becomes a little bit confusing to understand things. So I wanted to just take a minute and try to explain in layman's terms what I view the foundation budget as doing and how I see the system as working. So essentially, when you have those 11 factors that Roger describes, those develop the cost of education, and that's one half of the equation, developing what the right cost is, and I'm going to speak more to that in a minute. On the other side of the equation is developing what a community has as an ability to pay. Now, to answer the question that was asked earlier, the way that the community actually assesses that ability to pay is through the property tax. And that's the vehicle that's used. But there's also another measurement, and the way to look at this is that we look at a community's income to assess how much its residents can afford to pay. And the reason for that is to have a check as against the property tax so that we don't raise property taxes through overrides and other things to unreasonable mechanisms that people can't afford to pay. So yes, you pay through the property tax, but there's also a check built into the formula for your income to make sure that that amount doesn't exceed people's reasonable ability to pay. So what we wind up doing is developing cost over here and ability to pay over here, and the delta is what the state steps in and provides for aid. And one of the issues that comes up with the foundation budget formula is that if the foundation budget formula doesn't accurately reflect the cost of educating a student, it can affect aid because it's the delta between the cost and the ability to pay that determines your aid. And that's why it's very important that we have a foundation budget formula that actually depicts the cost that you're facing. And so one of the things that was essentially done in 1993, when we established the Education Reform Act of 1993, which is the basis for the vast majority of what we're talking about tonight, was to incorporate into that law a requirement that a Foundation Budget Review Commission review the foundation budget. And Roger, I believe it was every 2 years, but it's only issued about 2 reports. And so one of the great problems that we have is that the mechanism that was built into the system to keep pace with the changes that we're seeing actually isn't working, because we don't have those periodic reviews to say, is this formula accurate or is it not accurate? So that's one of the things that we have been fighting for, to try to get that done, not only every 2 years, but preferably every year, so that we can understand, is what we're saying required to educate a student, is that really the actual cost, and are those really the actual factors? And so that's one of the things that I think actually could make a major impact here. Second thing, question was asked about special education. There is no place in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that I go to talk about school finance where I don't hear about the cost of special education. Now, to his credit, the governor did try to increase the assumed number for special education enrollment in last year's budget. But notwithstanding that, that's an area that we need to look at, because it's something every community is facing. And Roger alluded to this just a little bit. when he talked about the fact that a factor that's in the foundation budget presumes full-time enrollment, and so it's lower than what actual enrollment is because a lot of IEPs aren't full-time enrollment. However, here's one of the things that I think we need to look at, and that is the fact that there are many students which are receiving services that prevent them from having an IEP, but of special education in nature. And from my personal perspective, I don't think the foundation budget formula picks that up or addresses it in the way that it could. And so one of the things that we've been fighting for as a legislative delegation is to have Salem State University look at the method by which we deliver special education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And one of the reasons that we want to do that is not only to look at that assumed rate of enrollment that's in the foundation budget, but also to look at ways that we could assist as the Commonwealth with costs that are not involved in the circuit breaker and are not involved in the assumed rate of enrollment in the foundation budget. And let me be more direct. We're trying to find ways by which we might be able to help communities be able to provide support services that might be able to help us avoid needing to have an IEP. Now, that doesn't mean we don't think we should have IEPs. Obviously, they're necessary, and we have to provide that education for kids. But if there are ways that we could use programs that are currently not funded the way that they could be by the state to help ease those costs for a very sizable percentage of the school population, we think we could do something meaningful. Over the last couple of years, the Senate has recognized that particular amendment in the state budget. We've not yet been able to get it through the House, despite the best efforts of Brad, and Lenny has been very supportive of this, but that's one of the areas that we need to look at. Another area, when we talk about the cost that's involved with special education, one of the things that we don't do as well as we could is recognize that there are really two costs. There's the cost of instruction, which is oftentimes in an outplacement recognized through a tuition payment, and there's the cost of transportation. And the cost of transportation, in many cases, equals or exceeds the cost of instruction. And so one of the things that we've been fighting for, and again, we have a couple of newcomers with Senator O'Connor Ives and Representative Mira, but one of the things that Brad and I have been fighting for over the years is to see if we can include the cost of transportation in the special education circuit breaker so that we can help with that. Now, that's a very costly proposition, but that also means it's very costly for the cities and towns that are paying it now. So that's one of the things that we want to look at. When Brad mentioned the issue of the lawsuits that have been undertaken around the country, it's very interesting because we actually went to the source and we talked to the one individual that's been involved in the vast majority of those suits. And by the way, there are very few examples in the history of this country, and certainly in Massachusetts, where changes to the formula haven't been predicated on a lawsuit. Now, there's certainly the one in 2007, that wasn't necessarily the case, but if you look at the others, they have largely been somehow related to a lawsuit. And if you look at the case of Walker v. Hancock, the case that Roger was referring to, you will see that Justice Botsford issued a 300-plus page report about problems with education in Massachusetts. But the court still found for the plaintiff, found for us, saying we had met our minimum obligation, our required obligation. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems. Here's the issue. Most of the cases that have been brought unsuccessfully, have been about the issue of equity. Does one student have the same ability to get an education as the other student? And in most cases, those lawsuits fail. The issue that has won more cases than not has been the issue of adequacy. Is the state doing enough to reach essentially 7 goals that the courts have recognized to educate children so that they can be competitive and that they can be well educated? And the group that Brad referenced has actually shifted gears and is starting to look at adequacy. Why is that important? Well, if we don't have a foundation budget formula that's adequate, then we aren't recognizing the cost of educating a student. And if we aren't properly educating the cost of educating a student, then how can we be providing adequate state aid to get the job done? The difficulty with all of that is that it takes a long time to be able to work through those issues and accomplish change, which is why in the interim, your legislative delegation oftentimes focuses on things like regional school transportation and the special education circuit breaker, because those do not depend on a change in a formula. When we increase the amounts for those things, school districts across the state receive a benefit without regard to the biases that we perceive to be in Chapter 70. The last thing that I'll touch on is the issue of changing Chapter 70. And one of the great difficulties with changing Chapter 70, and Roger's heard me say this because we've been on the road many times before, is that if you have a group of 200 legislators and you ask them, does Chapter 70 work? Is it functional? Despite the fact that Roger's made good arguments that it does, that it is, if you had 200 legislators, you would probably get about 150 hands that would say that it doesn't work. The difficulty is if you ask that same group of legislators, what is the solution, you'd get 150 different answers. And so trying to build consensus around that change is one of the problems. The second problem is that it takes a tremendous amount of money to be able to do it. And Roger alluded to this a little bit, because if you adjust the formula and you don't hold communities harmless, in other words, if you try to reach equity and some communities don't go down, then it's hard to reach that equity, and so you have to hold them harmless. So you have to hold them at a particular rate and increase others, and that takes tremendous amounts of money. And what we know over the last several years is there haven't been tremendous amounts of money in state government, and so it's been a difficult proposition. So it oftentimes sounds easy, and we'd all like to change Chapter 70 in one way or another, but getting consensus and having the amount of revenue that it would take to do that is very difficult. That's why you see us focusing, again, and I would credit the Rowley Board. We had a meeting 3 or 4 years ago about regional school transportation. It was a discussion much like this one, and your legislative delegation went to work to increase regional school transportation, and we've been somewhat successful at that. We've also worked very hard, again, at special education, because that's not dependent on the formula. So please understand that we're working very hard to try to get at a number of these things. The difficulty is trying to build legislative consensus and trying to have the resources to do it. I'll offer you one ray of hope, having said all of that. And that is that when I'll give you two. One is, we did actually pass a local aid resolution that Representative Hill made reference to that establishes minimum amounts of aid that communities can count on. Now, the reason that's so important is because everybody's trying to put together municipal and school budgets right now, and we won't be finished with our budget, if all goes according to plan, until July. And so you would likely say to us, how can we build a budget when we don't know what your budget's going to be? The local aid resolution, and we did argue with some of the components of it, and I won't belabor that, but we tried to do some things that Brad referenced. But the fact of the matter is, it has been adopted. The House has got to make some technical changes to it, but it has been adopted, so you know what those minimum levels of aid are going to be. And actually, in the packet that I'm going to leave for you, those numbers for the 3 communities and for Triton are included. So that's one issue that we're trying to provide some degree of certainty, and there is a minimum increase for everybody in that resolution. Second thing, as we look to the horizon, one thing that I think people forget too often is that when we pass gaming legislation in Massachusetts, a portion of the proceeds of gaming in the bill is dedicated to education. Now, when that bill moved through the Senate, a number of us amended it originally to say that it would go to raising the minimum target share to try to get to that 17.5% that Roger was talking about. It prevailed in the Senate, it didn't prevail in the House. But that money is not there yet. And we all have the ability to try to reach that money and decide what we're going to do with it through the democratic process. And so as gaming unfolds, and God knows it's been a rocky road, but as we start to see some of those funds, we should be talking about how we want to use them to benefit local education. And that may give us the opportunity to reach some of these issues that we haven't been able to reach because we haven't had funding. But the point is, the most difficult thing in affecting the changes that we'd all like to have is reaching consensus. That's why that group that now is pursuing legal action was begun in the first place, to try to bring like-minded communities together. And we have had some success, but we haven't had the kind of success that we'd like to have. So much of what I've told you and a little bit more is available in this packet. And so if you're having difficulty sleeping tonight, I would encourage you to take one of these and to read through it. But please know that we as legislators place a very high priority on the relationship that we have with our local officials, that we have with the school committees, the finance committees. We do have an open line of communication, and we very much value the ability that we have to work together. So we're happy to come whenever you want to have this discussion and to work with you and to roll up our sleeves and work our way through it. It has paid some dividends in the past. That doesn't mean it solved all the problems, and it also doesn't mean it will solve all the problems in the future. But what it does mean is that we are not powerless, and that we have the ability to do something about some of the things we've talked about tonight. So I'd also be happy to answer any questions, but just wanted to leave you with those thoughts. And Joe, I guess we'll open the floor in a minute, depending on what others want to say. So thank you.
My name's Debbie Choate. I'm chairperson of the Triton School Committee. And my voice isn't what it usually is, so I'm glad there's a microphone. Over the years, we've gone back and forth with budget talks all the time, and at many of our school committee meetings when we've had public hearings, we all understand that we should contact someone because we are not the people that we deal with what we're given. And Representative Hill said that you've run into some brick walls, stone walls, on things that you've proposed. Everybody in this room is here because we want to do something. So if you could tell us either who or what those brick walls are, give us places to write, names to contact, so that we can try and help you break down those brick walls, that would be great.
I use Mary as an example. He's our chair, as I said, and whenever we have issues that we want our school committees to contact the Speaker of the House or the chair, we will send the information to the chair, and then we will disseminate it out to the rest of the school committee, and we'll be more than happy to do that. Legislative amendments together, so you can let me know your email address,
Okay.
phone number, I can get you that information.
All right, thank you very much. Excuse me, I wasn't specifically thinking of just the school committee, although I appreciate that. That would be great. I'm thinking of the people in this room who are not elected officials, who might be able to contact someone to help make our case.
Contact any of our offices, once you get that contact person, we can get you that. Be more than happy.
Dale Williams from Newbury. I think it's 3 slides back. I don't know if you want to do it, but it's basically talking about how Chapter 70 has changed just since 2000. Triton gets the exact amount of money, $8 million a year. It's varied a little bit, but over the last 14 years, it stays, the red line is almost straight across from the year 2000 to fiscal year 15, whereas our budgets have gone up. My question is, if the state's commitment to Chapter 70 was $2.2 billion going back to fiscal year 2000, now it's $4.4 billion. It's gone up 40% through inflation and other things. Ours has stayed exactly the same. So a 40% increase in Chapter 70 funds have equated to an equivalent $8 million every year for us. Ours hasn't gone up, even by inflation standards. Can you explain that? It went from 2.5 billion in fiscal year 2000 to now 4.4 billion in fiscal year 15.
Well, the state defines what is the right amount for the district to receive. That amount has been going down because enrollment has been going down. Foundation budgets have been going down. The amount that you've been grandfathered into is more than what that target represents.
But do you see over a 14-year period that if we get the same $8 billion and the school's costs and the town's costs have gone up and see no increase in Chapter 70? Where did the other $1.9 billion go in Chapter 70? Are you saying it goes to all the gateway cities? Is that where it's going?
No. In fact, a lot of people think that.
Yeah.
That is not the case.
Okay.
You know, when you look at who gets the big increases, is not one particular type of community.
Okay.
You know, it's all those 6 factors playing a role in determining their foundation budget. How much do they need to fund the foundation budget? And in many cases, it does mean substantial aid increases. You're right. Triton currently, as planned for fiscal 15, is receiving just slightly less than what it got, you know, going way back.
Yeah.
I think it got 8.8 million in fiscal 03, if I'm not mistaken. So, yes, that seems harsh. It does. There are 50 districts that in fiscal 14 were receiving less than what they received in fiscal 03. But there are reasons for that. Back in fiscal 03, we didn't have a definition of what the right amount is. I'd say that's the predominant
Okay.
answer to the question.
It's
I mean,
still
it's a good, it's a logical
It's a still
question.
flat dollar amount with escalating costs
Yes.
in the schools and
Yeah,
the towns.
right.
My other question is for the representatives and the senators. Massachusetts, 40 states invest more in education as per capita than the state of Massachusetts. We are 41st in the country. Obviously, it's the crux of this whole discussion. Why is the commitment to education in Massachusetts exceeded by 40 states, and we're in the bottom 10 states in the country? Why? It's the state share of school funding. Massachusetts ranks 40th out of 50. I think there's 50 states. No, I realize that. Right, but my point is it's coming on the backs of the towns and the local assessments because the state, as you can see, the level of funding just for Triton has stayed the same over 14 years. But the Chapter 7 funding has gone way up. So we rank 40th in the country as our commitment of state funds to education, and it puts the backs on the local tax assessments to make up the difference. So total cost of education. 40 states invest more to meet that need in their states than the state of Massachusetts does. So it comes back to us as local communities to take a bigger and bigger bite out of the pie. And that's where I believe the frustration comes with the citizens, with the selectmen, with the school committee, and why we all try to look to Chapter 70 and say, is this going to stay $8 billion forever as our cost to educate our kids continues to escalate just by inflation, let alone special ed and all the other stuff?
I'm going to give you a short answer, and it's an opinion, not a fact. The $8 million, that's the frustration I think that you can hear from all of us, is we've put the most money we've ever put into Chapter 70, and there are communities that aren't seeing any increase at all. Clearly, there's a problem, in our view, with the way we distribute money, and that's why we're trying to make changes. Number two, I told you earlier there are 200 legislators who have 200 different opinions on how to spend $32 billion. Your delegation, doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, have stood strong together in trying to increase those dollars for Chapter 70. I think I explained to you the amendments on the 17 and a half. Bruce talked to you about the casino money going into the 17 and a half. Once you get to the House, they seem to want to take those dollars and put them into other programs, not necessarily into education. It's frustrating for a lot of us. Bruce talked briefly about the fact that if you really took all these dollars and you put it into the formula and didn't hold everybody harmless, you would see a very different number for Triton. That's frustrating to us. But there's not one legislator who will vote to decrease any money for their school districts. And when it comes to city versus suburban, we're actually 7 or 8 legislators short. So whenever there's a vote, when it comes suburban versus urban, we're going to lose that vote every time by 7 or 8 votes. We've had a couple of opportunities where we've had that vote, and again, they have not stood with us because they would have seen decreases in their allocation. So my opinion is, once you get to the House, there are a difference of opinions on how to spend our dollars. There are many of us who want to spend it on education. There are many others who want to spend it on some of the programs that I spoke about, whether it's homelessness, drug addiction programs, the environment. If you look at and I'm just giving you an example since you've asked, the environmental agencies have seen tremendous cuts to the tune of 40% in some cases, so that we could put monies into public safety. We have what we call them sacred cows. Just like you do in the cities and towns, we have to pay our unfunded pension liability. We've pushed it out a few years. We just brought it back. We also are now dealing with OPEB. And very frustrating, ladies and gentlemen, all the tobacco trust money that are supposed to be going into these programs to help with smoking cessation and other health-related programs, 100% of those dollars are now going to go to pay for the OPEB obligation to the state of Massachusetts. So in order to backfill the smoking cessation programs and others, we have taken these additional dollars that I spoke of, and we've backfilled some of those. We have about 3 or 4 other sacred cows that we have to pay, and they just take these dollars and throw them in there, in my opinion.
Well, I appreciate that. So what would your message be to the local leaders of the Selectmen, Finance Committee, school committees of these towns if Chapter 70 is not going to change appreciably in the near term? Because we're going to face this every budget season. Is the only answer a Prop 2.5 override? Is that the only solution to have a balanced budget in these towns in the near term?
I can't answer that question because I don't have a crystal ball, but I will tell you on a state level, I think I've just heard tonight we're going to have more of an open dialogue. We're going to let you know what we're proposing, what we're doing, and we're going to ask you folks to send letters, to make phone calls to the House leaders. As Bruce said, a lot of this has gotten through the Senate, and it stops in the House because of different priorities. They need to hear from us. As I said earlier, and I hate to keep bringing this up, last week I would have thought we would have had 200 selectmen on the steps of Beacon Hill going crazy that we took $75 million of your dollars away and put it in the general fund. And when there was an opportunity for us to put it back, we didn't hear a peep from anybody.
I don't think anybody knew about it.
And that's the problem. And I take full responsibility from this point on. You will know what we're doing. We sent out press releases to the local newspapers. They didn't pick them up. We let them know that we were putting out a resolution. We let them know exactly how much money it would have been for each city and town. And we didn't get a lot of press on it, unfortunately. From this point on, we will get it right to you so that you can get it out.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody being here tonight.
You mentioned something that, could you explain to people what OPEB is? Okay?
Oh, no, we'd be here another 2 hours.
No, because you mentioned that, and people don't realize that's something that's coming down. Okay.
It's the retiree health benefits for cities and towns. You have your retirement obligations, your unfunded liabilities as well, and the OPEB, which is, and tell me if my memory is not serving me, but thank you very much. This is something cities and towns are just now starting to deal with, but it's retirees' health benefits that aren't currently being looked at by your the bond rating, and it's something that we're concerned about, that they may come all of a sudden look at this and put it as part of your obligations to pay. We're trying to work on it. We had a commission that was set up by the governor. He's come back with suggestions. We hope to be able to take that up in the next couple of months so that we can help cities and towns with their OPEB, but it's retirement benefits for the health care.
Thank you. Anyone else got any questions?
I actually want to ask, Roger, can I ask you to take that microphone? I just want to ask you a question. So one of the things that I know that people have been particularly aggrieved by is something that Dale just raised, and that is the issue of Triton's aid being essentially level funded. But I want to make sure I understand your answer correctly, and I'd like to ask for some clarification. So one of the issues that Triton, it seems, benefits from is that normally its state aid would be even less because of some factors, but the reason that it's at a flat line is because it's essentially being held harmless from other changes. So no, it's important to understand that the state is actually artificially keeping the number higher than it would normally be.
Yes.
Okay.
Somewhere in the range of 350 to 400 million, more than, if they brought it all the way down to the target. That's about the scope of the problem.
Okay, and so just one other point of clarification, when we talk about the cost of education and costs going up, if we look at the period of time between fiscal year '07 and fiscal year '15, just roughly, if we look at foundation enrollment at Triton, I believe it's 700 fewer students. And since the formula is based on how many students you have multiplied by the foundation budget, would that normally not dictate a reduction in the cost and in the state aid?
It does, and you can see that in the foundation budget, which is dropping year after year, starting at this point. It's because there are fewer kids.
Right. Okay. I think that's an important point. And so it also suggests that if you want to try to change that, there may be other costs going up, but the number of students is going down, and in other communities, the number of students may be going up. Yeah. And those communities oftentimes will come to us and say, if we have more students, we should be getting more, and if you have fewer students, you should be getting less. Isn't that the political dilemma that we face?
It is, and, I think it probably puts legislators in a very difficult position, but, there really is no appetite whatsoever for getting to target by reducing aid, that 350 or 400 million. You just can't do it under Prop 2.5. Our hope is that the formula over time will bring those aggrieved communities we saw and that scattergram up to their target, and that over time, if it has to be minimal increases like minimum aid, $25 per pupil, okay, so that actually makes the inequities greater, but not by a lot. Mm-hmm. In the big picture, I don't think that adds all that much to the aided group.
Mm-hmm. So again, to answer Dale's question about what communities can do, number one, I would suggest, and I would ask your opinion on this proposition, that given the declining level of students, one of the things that you have to do if you want to see more money in the communities that are served by Triton is to change the foundation budget to recognize increased cost per student.
Yes.
So that's one option that we have.
Yep.
In addition to that, it would strike me that trying to recognize in a way that is different than perhaps today that we might be able to get at the cost of special education, again, because it's not formula-based, is a second way to help Triton and its communities to be able to try to get more aid if we can accomplish that.
Sure, through the formula or through the circuit breaker or some as yet to be determined new way of doing it.
Sure. And then the third thing is that, particularly given your last statement about the issue of inequity or equity of the minimum aid, it doesn't change the equities that much, that a change in minimum per pupil aid in any given year might not skew the formula that badly, but might actually help Triton significantly. In other words, going from $25 to $50 or something along those lines.
Yeah, I guess, in the big picture and in the context of the entire budget for Triton, $25 per pupil helps a little bit, but it's not very much. It's less than $100,000.
I guess what I'm suggesting is that one way in the current dynamic that we face to be able to help Triton would be to try to increase minimum per pupil aid. Again, if we were able to double it, it would be more than we might see from other changes.
that is one way that, they could be helped to a moderate degree.
I apologize for the leading questions, but the witness is excused.
Christopher, yes.
Thank you, Christopher Farmer, Superintendent. I don't have a question, but I'd like to add a footnote to the recent exchange about declining numbers. People often ask the question, well, your numbers are going down, therefore why can't you make savings? And the issue is that we organize schools around classes, not around numbers of students. And if the number of students drops by about 600, you've got to see that reduction across 13 grade levels, across a number of classes at each grade level. And so the question is, has the reduction been sufficient to enable you to take out a class at any particular grade level? And the problem is no. The other problem is that we are increasingly enrolling students with more complex disabilities who can be included in a smaller size classroom, but are included with much more difficulty in a larger size classroom. I offer those observations just to indicate that there isn't a linear relationship between the number of students and the number of teachers.
Anyone else? All right. I've got a question, Roger. When the district was originally formed, okay, the question of transportation came up. And at that point, the carrot that the state gave us was, we'll pay for transportation. And that never happened. I think it happened 1 year, and then it's failed since then. What do we have to do to get that reinstated?
I've heard people in the department, address that question by saying, is what really matters to districts which vehicle they get their money from? Or isn't it really, what's the total amount coming in? And that's sort of a simplistic answer to your question, but would you rather have, a $500,000 increase in transportation and get aid taken away from Chapter 70? Or, the bottom line is really what I think matters to most districts. It is true, the intent was 100%. That was a long time ago. But they did do it for a couple of years.
When we didn't have the two-tier payment, everything,
Yeah.
a lot of things changed.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, I'd like to thank everyone that came up here. Thank all you people for taking the time to attend. And again, like Brad said, he's going to get a better line of communication to the towns. Senator Tarr's office always does. And Lenny's at Town Hall on a regular basis. But anything to do with education, we need to know so we can pass on. All right? Okay. All right. Thank you.